Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of On Air with Intentional Guy. We are talking today with Sylvia Worsham. Sylvia, thank you so much for being on our show today. I'm looking forward to our conversation. So, we are here today talking about trauma, you know, and I love it. I saw it in your thing from survivor to thriver, and I really like that because the enemy is out seeking whom he may destroy,
Mhm.
right? And it's amazing that what God can do when we turn it over to him and how he does it. Just a little short information on me. So, back during Hurricane Sally, me and my wife, a tree fell on our house during Hurricane Sally, crushed our house, did over $100,000 worth of damage, all that to our home. And we went to get tarps 2 days after the hurricane or day after. And we were on our way back, and a tanker truck ran over the top of us,
Mm.
crushed our car. If you can look at the pictures, you can see on the driver's side, I could touch and feel the tank of the truck um, that was there. And what happened to me was I went through one of the worst moments of my life from that. The pain was out of this world. Just severe trauma. I for a living, I drove on sales car calls and stuff like that. I could not even do that anymore. I saw my sales declining. It took me 6 months before I even got back to work. So I ended up having to change careers. I after that wreck, because everything was shut down, it took me months before I could even really get an MRI. Doctors didn't want to touch me without the MRI to see what damage was done. And so I couldn't sleep for over a month. I was just on the couch in pain, and an overwhelming amount of depression came upon me. The
Mm.
enemy started having my ear again, and I didn't realize the effect that uh, a traumatic event like that could happen. And you can do a couple things. You can let that uh, define who you are and get you to give up on life, or you can allow God to come in and shine and show you how he is going to work in the midst of that. And in the midst of that, what came out of that counseling was I ended up writing a book. I ended up dealing with trauma from when I was really young,
Mhm.
um, that I never dealt with. And I became the man that God always wanted me to be. But I went through spiritual counseling, went through all this stuff. And I'm so glad that I did not let all these past events in my life define who I am today. And it would have been easy to do that. So I tell you that, putting that up there, because I know there's a lot of people. Maybe you're not in a car wreck. I know it could be divorce. It could be the loss of a child. It could be so much stuff. So um, I'm so happy to have you, Sylvia, on here today. And I would love to just hand this over to you for a minute. You share your story and your thoughts on what God has on your heart today for our discussion.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I felt the Holy Spirit presence as you were speaking, and I know that He sent you to me directly because we both have been through similar events. Mine wasn't as visually traumatic; mine was happening on the inside, uh, and I'm just overjoyed to be able to be here today to talk about change and how it's really an opportunity that God uses to, one, teach us lessons that equips us for what's coming down our path, and two, is our opportunity to shift the lens of our life to really step into that soul identity that we were born to be. Before tragedy and trauma and modeling and childhood events and experiences kind of marred our that beautiful light that we all carry inside of us. So I came from a different background. I came from corporate America. I landed in corporate America because I was someone who was raised um, with perfection and high achieving ways, and I myself did not feel enough. I had a trauma early on in my life that at 7 years of age that really kind of shaped that person that I became in my early 20s and 30s. And it wasn't until I got a divorce, I was a single mom, and I started dating my second husband, that awakening occurred, that kind of made that shift from living a life of survival, of fear, of ego driven choices, to the life that I live today. And I kind of faced a firing squad of 6 doctors in my hospital room. I had been admitted during Easter weekend, of all weekends. Good Friday, I was
Mm.
admitted to St. Luke's Episcopal Hospital in Houston, Texas, with multiple pulmonary embolisms. And for those that don't know what a pulmonary embolism is, it's basically your blood clots and it travels to your lungs, and it could block your heart, it could travel to your brain, and you can have a stroke or a heart attack. So I had multiple. I was fully infiltrated by them. And on the early morning hours of Good Friday is when I received my first miracle. I was in a hotel room. We were going to be traveling to Louisiana for Easter weekend with my boyfriend and my son. And I mean, he was little. My little boy was little. And in the middle of the night, I had like what resembled a heart attack, this horrible pain that jolted me out of bed. And it was like 50 knives were piercing my chest every time I took a breath. And I felt a prompting from God very strongly. It came through. It said, lean forward and you'll be able to breathe. And I leaned forward. And that's the first miracle I received, because the very next day when they do a scan of my lungs and they see the problem, a doctor comes into my ER and says, I am truly shocked you're sitting up talking to me right now. You should be dead. Those
Mm.
pulmonary embolisms,
Wow.
that pain that you felt, those were the blood clots going through your heart, and they were so large. I'm surprised they didn't stop your heart. You have a massive heart attack. And I'm sitting there at 37 years old, kind of like, wow, how is this happening? Right. And I have my little boy outside with my boyfriend, who he's only seen like twice before in his life. And, as a single mom, the first thing is get up and do something with your little boy, right? You don't care what's going on inside of you. And luckily, God was in control, and my mom arrives and my sister-in-law arrives, and they take my son back. And the doctors are like, we can't let you go for a couple of days because there's something else going on in your liver, and we don't know what's going on. And that's when 6 doctors walk into my room the very next day, and they basically have told my entire family of siblings that are doctors that I have a 20% chance of surviving. They don't tell me that, but they basically kind of paint the picture, a very grim picture to me. And I, in the moment when they start speaking and saying that they're going to rush me to ICU, they're going to start me on this very aggressive therapy, I have this moment of total surrender to God. Even in my greatest terror and fearful space that I was in, I surrendered to him and I accepted whatever path God had me on. I knew that God had my back, and I trusted him fully to take the reins of my life and use my choices to kind of guide me. And the very next day, a woman with a Catholic diocese walked into my ICU room. The therapy they had me on didn't know. They were not really sure it was going to work out. And if it didn't work out, the option they had for me likely would have dealt with death. So I was really in critical condition. And she walks into my room, and my boyfriend's in the room, and she says, do you want to pray with me? And it was such a powerful moment because we start praying the Our Father. And the part where it says, thy will be done, there is an enormous love that envelops the entire room. And I felt like God was cradling me in his arms. And in a moment of, honestly, of terror, I felt peace wash over me, and I felt a knowing. I knew I was okay. I knew that the therapy had worked and that I would have no long-term complications. And it was an immediate knowing. So I was at
Mm.
peace. in that moment. And that's the second miracle. And then the third and final miracle is when they do the scan to see like if the therapy had worked. The doctors were in complete shock because the size of the clots should have left holes in my lungs, and they didn't.
Wow.
They were completely shocked. I had no long-term complications. I walked out of there 2 weeks later. And I'd love to say that that was like the beginning of the awakening. But as human beings, we are flawed. We are flawed in a way where we have all these fear-based beliefs that are really steering the choices we make in life. And my identity was tied to a paycheck, and my
Yes.
worth was tied to a paycheck. And as a woman, it was very hard for me to make those changes in my life that required stepping into faith. Right. So I walk out of there alive, and I go back to my old life in corporate America, and I proceed to work in it for another year and a half. And then I have a miscarriage. I marry my boyfriend. We're pregnant with our child, and I'm in a very stressful, high sales position with medical device sales here in Austin, Texas. And I lose my baby. And I make the decision to trade everything off, like all of this significance and all of this worth and this money. And I become a stay-at-home parent. And I trust the God instinct of like, step away from this. This is not your life anymore. I need you to trust me.
Mm.
And what follows is the greatest lesson I ever learned was patience in his timing, because he was putting everything in order. He was chiseling away all these elements that did not fit with the woman he had created me to be.
Oh, wow. Yep.
Right. So it takes a couple of years, where
Yes.
I step into this role now that I am an author and a speaker, but I how I step in there is I follow his promptings. I
Yep.
follow his promptings and I act on them more than anything. So,
Wow. And that's really, I think that's foreign to a lot of people under trying to understand some of what you just said, that you're waiting for God's prompting, because uh I think one of the biggest things that I had to get through was that God's ways are not my ways.
yes.
And so a little background on this was, um with us, me and my wife, our identity was always linked to failures in our lives. And we
Mm,
gave those failures so much more power than we gave to God, that God had in our life, right? And I remember one of the biggest areas that God fought us was our finances. I mean, not God, Satan fought us was our finances. That's where he
mhm,
destroyed us a lot. We lived paycheck to paycheck. And I remember my wife saying, you know, what we have that theological thing that God must be punishing us for our past. And well, that's the enemy in our ear,
mhm,
because God wants us to thrive and know him. But we weren't looking to him. We were looking at the failures instead and our own doings. And one of the amazing things through this whole thing was we started going to a Dave Ramsey course because we were like, let's get rid of um where the enemy we identified where the enemy was getting us in our finances, right?
mhm,
So we knew that. So what we devised a plan, let's do what we can. And so what we could do was we could go to a Dave Ramsey course at our church. I'm going to tell you, I was so defeated when I did that course. Okay. Because the first thing he said was, one of the things we want you to do is have $1,000 in your savings account. $1,000 to us was like $100,000 to us.
mhm,
We're not even knowing where our electric bill is going to be paid, you know? And we were so overwhelmed. But I'm going to tell you, honestly, the enemy had our ear way more than God had our ear.
mhm,
We ended up going through the Dave Ramsey course a year later again. And I remember we had this moment in our life where we said, God, we don't know how you're going to do this, but we're going to surrender to you. Now, this is
Mhm.
before the wreck and everything. We're like, we're going to surrender to you.
Mhm.
Now, if I knew what God's ways were, I would have probably said, no, thank you. But this, you know,
Yeah, I
but
tell
this,
you, I'm with you.
but God used that trauma in our life to
Yes.
change everything
Mhm.
about us,
Mhm.
because in that it forced so many things. And in the midst of it, I almost felt like God had abandoned us. I almost felt that way. But I held on to my faith that, and I like what you said. It doesn't happen overnight.
No.
It takes time. It took time for us to get to this place that we're at, and it's going to take us time to get there, because one of the things that I was doing was I was building a new authentic relationship with Christ. And when you're
Yes.
building a relationship, it does take time. But today I'm sitting here after the wreck, and I give all the glory to God, because
Yes.
God used that wreck. Now, we're not rich by any means or anything, but God used that wreck to give us a settlement that paid all our bills
It's
and
interesting how
gave
that
us,
happens, right?
isn't it? And now, if you would have told me God's going to put you through this major wreck and this is how I'm going to do that, we would have been like, no, I think we're good. We're good, God, you know? But, and I'm not saying that God uses that all the time that way to do it, but we have to be surrendered to who God is. And sometimes we see these traumatic events as punishment or something else, but it's also, I see it where God is forging us, because it also forced me when I was younger. I was sexually molested as a child,
Oh, I'm sorry.
but I was never able to deal with that. Never able, never done. My family never knew about it, but it was in the midst of that counseling. God said, I'm not just going to heal you
Mhm.
here, Mike. I'm about to, I'm about to heal, I'm make you whole.
Yes.
And um, I had been on a 15 years of trying to of finding redemption through a failure of mine. And it was in this that God did that for me. And I tell you all that because now today we're thriving, and not just me, just because I was obedient and
Yes.
I did what God wanted me to do and I followed it no matter how hard, it trickled over into my family. And I see how it changed my wife, how it changed my son, how it changed my daughter, and how we now as a family are thriving. I never saw myself as a spiritual leader of my family because my identity was something horrible, right? So I'm amazed as I sit back and I see how God can work through some of what we would consider the worst moments of our life, the worst things to happen to us, but where God can have victory in that. So, with saying all that, talking to some of our people here today, Sylvia, how would you encourage some of the people who are in the? I think one of the biggest problems that people do today is they don't recognize the trauma for what it is. They don't. We try to put our heads in the sand, and if you don't deal with something, you can't fix it. It can't be fixed. And if
Or
you
the
run from
lesson.
God over it,
Yeah.
yes, you can't learn the lesson that God
Yeah.
has for you.
Mm.
So what would you say to them and encourage some of my listeners today that are in the midst of that?
Change really is an opportunity. And I know when you're in the midst of it, it doesn't seem like that. It seems like life is happening to you, not in your favor. And that's a different mindset shift that comes with time. And you do need to work and identify what's at the root of your choices. Our choices get steered by our what coaches call subconscious programming. Let me explain what that means and bring you some overview on that. We have two
Okay.
minds. We have the subconscious mind and we have the conscious mind. The subconscious mind is the one that is the most powerful one of the two. It represents about 90% of our total daily activities. And it's our emotional mind. This is where our feelings, what we believe about ourselves, our habits, our patterns of behavior, that's where it resides. And it's stored. And it's been stored there since before the age of 7. Some of your beliefs have been formed. And it's
Mhm.
all these experiences and all these childhood experiences that we have, and these memories and this unhealed trauma is in that part of the mind. And it's what's really at the root. That our belief is what promotes our thoughts, that promote our feelings, that then we have reactions to our feelings. And those are the results we're currently seeing in our life. So at the root of it is your belief and your trauma. Your significant emotional events are right at the root of it. So what I suggest with people is going through change, realize that that's in control. But you also have your conscious mind. You have your thoughts and your attitudes and your self-talk, and you have control over that. And what you can start doing is start to change the thoughts that you allow inside of your mind. You don't have to believe anymore that you are not enough. You can start telling yourself
Yes.
you are enough. And that's what we call
Yeah.
affirmations. And we do this daily. And at first, it feels funny. You feel awkward. But I find it so interesting that we don't miss an opportunity to call ourselves losers and no good people. And we can say that out loud, but we feel funny talking loving to ourselves the way that God would speak to us. I think that's so interesting, don't you?
Yes. Yes.
And at first, it's baby steps. With anything, it's about consistency. It's about building
Yes.
a habit every single day to connect inward, because our answers are inside of us. They're nowhere outside of us. We always look for it in our achievements, in getting more, and that's our subconscious programming doing that. Those are our fears in control. That's where the devil resides a lot of times, where he's telling us, you're not enough. You see, it's happening to you. You shouldn't believe in God. And we start
Yep.
to think that God has abandoned us, when in truth, it's really just our programming. And so, what we really need to do is take a step back and start connecting to God daily. Even if it's for a minute a day, start small.
Yes.
Start very, very small. The very first thing I do in my mornings is I have a self care routine. And that's because I want to connect with God daily. So at 5 a.m., the first thing I do is I connect with Him. And the first question I ask Him is, who am I to bless today? How do you need me to, to use my gifts today to help your master plan and fulfill your master plan for my life? And I exercise and I journal and I connect to him daily, no matter what. So there's a lot of things that can happen when change occurs. When change occurs, to realize that it is a time for you to reflect. It is a time for you to allow um, everything you're learning to catch up to you. And that is a very important skill set to develop, and an important habit to promote to anyone going through major change. And realize that you're not alone,
Mm.
ever. You're never alone. God is always there. He's always next to you. And all he's asking for is for you to trust him, because we can believe in him, but even the devil believes in him. But the question I'm going to ask you today is, do you trust him? Do you
Mm.
trust him to guide you to your light?
Yep. And I love that. Man, Sylvia, that's just I just feel the power of God right now, because one of the premises of this show is intentionality, being intentional. In fact, I'm working on probably changing the name. This is Intentional Guy. We have, and I think sometimes women think they can't be on the show because it says Intentional Guy. I'm Intentional Guy. So it's probably going to be the Intentional Podcast is where I'm probably taking it to. But it's so funny that what you just said. It's all about being intentional in your journey. And it's a lot of us are so guilty for letting life lead us instead of us, letting Christ lead life for us and being making choices. And I'm thinking of some people right now, and some of them are gonna think you're talking about me indirectly. No, there's several people. And I know a couple of ladies right now who are in such abusive relationships or just got out of some abusive relationships that don't believe they are enough, who the enemy has put in these labels and lies about them through this whole journey, and where they feel alone. And I love the encouragement that you just gave them, because they're not. All you can do is what you can do. And you
Mhm.
need to get up every day with an intentionality not to believe it. That traumatic event that happened to me when I was a kid caused me every day of my life up until just 2 years ago. Every day I told myself I hate me.
Aw,
Every day I told myself you're stupid. Every day.
wow.
But after learning to be intentional and changing what I speak over myself, and my counselor was so great at pulling that out of me and saying, "Why are you saying that?
Mhm.
This, you are wonderfully made. That is not how God sees you.
No.
And you need to stop saying that. I don't want you to say that again.
Mhm.
Instead, when you say that, I want you to change it back to, that's a lie, enemy, and I am the man. I am a wonderful man that God has created, and God is building a great character in me right now. And we don't have to be perfect." And
No.
so I stopped that. But guilt and shame were such a big part of my life, and people carry guilt and shame that they don't even deserve. The
No.
enemy has put that in there, and I give credit. We always give the enemy our ear. I listen to the enemy way more than I listen to God. Why? That's a choice.
Mhm.
And so now when these negative thoughts come to me, I have to ask myself, is that God? Is that the creator of my life? Is that what he's speaking over me, or is that what the enemy's speaking over me? And let me tell you, it's hard to train your mind to do that. It's taking about a couple years to get to that point where I can do that. So it doesn't happen overnight, but I had to start somewhere.
Yeah, and it's every day. And even the days that you miss, just realize this, and I just want you, it kind of is similar to health. You know how some people have this unrealistic thing that they're 300 pounds and they want to lose 100 pounds in a week. I mean, that's really unrealistic. When you look at subconscious programming and you look at your age, realize that some of these beliefs that you have about yourself, about being stupid and about being a loser, formed before the age of 7. Now, I'm
Yes.
48 years old and I don't have a problem sharing my age on air, as I have no issues there. But realize how many years of programming did it take until you broke that habit?
Right.
You have to give yourself a little bit of grace when you do
Yes.
fall off the wagon, and it will happen because we are flawed. We are not perfect. He's perfect. We're not. So, what would he do for us? He gives us grace. And so we take a step back and say, okay, look at all the days you did tell yourself you were amazing and a God's masterpiece. Focus
Yeah.
on that. There's a big thing here that can also help us. It's the law of focus. It's a universal law. What we focus on, we find. What we focus on grows. What we focus on seems real. And ultimately, what we focus on, we become. So think about it. If you're constantly focused on how you're not enough, that's all you're going to see. And it's going to seem
Mm.
very
So
real to
good.
you. And so, how do we do this? Every day, consistently, we tell ourselves something good about ourselves. And what I've told myself to bring me closer to God is, I am God's masterpiece. And I tell myself that
Mhm.
every day. And I look at myself in the mirror, and even if I didn't believe it initially, because you won't, you will not believe it at first. But the more you tell yourself that, the more you make it a habit, the more your mind starts to adopt it as your truth. Because what you said was true. You have believed these lies that the enemy has shared with you, that your subconscious mind has like formed for you. But you have programmed that mind. You can deprogram it at any time. You
Yep.
can do that for yourself.
And I think what's so important, and I say this over and over, and I hope people get it. And I have some friends who I talk to, and it's hard work. All of this is hard work. It's not all. It may seem easy when you see someone's life and you're like, yeah, but it's not always been easy
Mm-mm.
to get to this point. You missed the struggles. I've had people say, you and your wife, I want a marriage like what you guys have. Listen,
You're like,
we're lucky we're not divorced today by the grace of God, you know, because we had a lot of ugliness
yeah.
involved in our life, but because of the right choices and sticking with it and staying with it, God has redeemed that. Now we have a great marriage, but it took a lot of hard work on our part. But I found out too, though, it is so important to have the right people in your life
Yes.
who will speak the truth to you as well. I get to choose who's in my life, and I don't believe in throwing away people, and it's not about throwing away people,
No.
but I don't have room for negative people in my inner circle. Those people are the people I'm ministering to see if I can help them change their mindset and things like that. But I have a core group of people who we build each other up. And when
Yes.
the enemy puts a lie in us, guess what? We're going to help each other. That's who's saying that? Is that the enemy
Hmm.
or is that God? And I have one friend who is great at always when something happens. Okay, we're looking at the negative, but what's the win?
Yeah.
Where is
Where's the
God in
opportunity?
this?
Yeah. Where's the
Yes.
lesson? Where's the lesson? Because when I reflected, like after I became an author, as I was becoming an author, let's put it that way. In 2020, when the prompting came to write my book, It's Time, Trust Me, I already had a relationship with Christ. I had a relationship that went beyond belief, believing in him. I was already trusting him because every time he prompted, I acted because I saw that in reflection of my life, his hand in everything. But it was that time frame, and that's what healed me, was the writing of that book. I was able to forgive
Mm,
my father for the trauma that occurred when I was 7 years old. I was able to forgive my bullies in high school who had pretty much traumatized me to the point where, and I've never revealed this in an interview, but I will today because I'm feeling prompted to do so. I felt so ugly because I had boys that would invite me to dances and then they would, uh, 2 days before a dance, say, no, I can't take you. And they would take another girl. So I had very bad beliefs
wow.
about myself. I thought I was ugly to the point where um, I had plastic surgery to on my nose to make me more beautiful because I believed myself to be ugly. I mean, who does that at 15?
Right.
That I mean, these are things that you now know how these fears play into your choices in life. And it took till 2017 for me to understand where that belief was coming from, how it actually surfaced into my awareness. When I wrote the book, I I became whole again because I saw the lessons that God taught me through these turning points in my life. That's why I became a turning points coach because I found a shortcut to joy, a shortcut to God and joy that I share freely in my book so that people don't have to take the exit highways I took that took years to get to the place I'm at now. I didn't want humanity to go through that. I wanted them to find God faster and joyfully and find that joy in the journey because no matter what storm you're going through, there's joy to be had.
That's right.
We just miss it because we are so caught up in our fears, in
Yeah.
what how we're not enough and how life is happening to us that we miss entire years of our life feeling sorry for ourselves when in reality it was there all along. God was with us all along and joy was within us all along. We just chose to focus on our fears. We chose
Yeah.
to focus on our failures as opposed to focusing on what we were learning and the opportunity that God was providing us through this change, through this awakening, whatever that is. And it doesn't have to be a near death experience like I experienced or like the intentional guy experienced. It could be anything in life that you feel is major for you. It is your journey. You have choices, and God is always with you, no matter what.
Yeah. Wow. And you're so right. Fear. I see so many people who are guided and live life in the lens of fear, and God has not created us for that.
No.
And I hope today, as people are listening to this conversation, that they can glean joy from this and realize that there God wants you to have joy. And if you're sitting here and you're listening to us, you don't have joy in your life, what can you do right now to change that? And it's to make a decision to seek joy out. It is that simple. And to say, I I crack up because I was never this person before. And if people see me on the road driving, they probably think I'm crazy. Or if you're in the other room and hear me, but I rebuke the enemy now. When the enemy comes at my with these thoughts, I'm like, I call him out and I tell him to
Mhm.
leave. And then I ask the Holy Spirit, show me the truth right
Mhm.
now and help me to verbalize it out of my mouth right now. Because if I can verbalize it, I can it helps me a little bit more. And
Yes.
I have never known the Holy Spirit to fail me
No.
in that. And it doesn't it's that's not a 5-minute thing, and I'm not a holy roller here saying, "Look how great that I'm doing that." No, I've had to learn this because
Mhm.
I'm fighting for my life right now.
Mhm.
I do not want to ever go back to being that person who I once was before God redeemed me and changed my life for so much better. And I want to stay on this path. So I have to be intentional every day doing it and not live in fear because I'm
Yes.
living in fear of stuff I cannot control.
No.
Only God can control that. You know, I give it all to God, and I what I can do is I can choose how I respond, how I react, and how I choose to perceive these things. I've had to have some major paradigm shifts in my life because we always go off of what we could see and what we can know. And I had to realize that it's not about what I can see and what I know, but what
Mhm.
God sees and what God
God
knows.
knows.
And God will reveal that in His time, not my time. All I have to do is just be faithful to Him, and God will be faithful back. I have not seen Him not to be faithful back to me.
We
So,
honor God through our actions. When we honor God through our actions, we're honoring ourselves and we're honoring our spouses and everybody that surround us when we honor him. And I I I can relate to everything you were saying. I mean, it took me a couple of years. It took me 20, no, over 30 years for me to step into that soul identity, that beautiful light he had. And I'm still going through some shifts. In fact, I just went through a major shift in my relationships. And I remember just speaking to God, and it was amazing because for the first time in my life, I did not reach out to anyone else, which was so uncharacteristic of me. I simply reached out to him directly and I said, "Bring me back to love. Bring him back to me in love." And I just prayed and I read the Bible that day. It was just a very spiritual day for me. And it was so impactful. It was so powerful because what it taught me was I don't really need to seek the answers outside of myself anymore. The answers are within him and within my soul. And they've
yes,
been there all along. What has happened is that all of these fears, all of this need for certainty, you were a security seeker, that's a pattern of behavior. That's in the subconscious programming that develops with trauma. When we're little, all these patterns of behavior develop, and we're not our patterns. That's our
yeah,
subconscious programming. That's not the soul identity that I reveal in my book, Journey to Me, Trust the Wisdom of Change. It is this, the soul identity is the identity that God created you to be, with your gifts, with joy and grace, and it's there inside of you. It's been inside of you all along, but fear has been on top of it. And that's why we keep saying over and over again in this interview, you got to remove that fear. And to remove that fear is not just this easy thing, well, I'm just going to take it away. And you got to
Right.
understand where it's coming from. You got to come to terms with some of this trauma that has been leading and steering your choices in life. Uproot it completely and start from there, and start making some of these new habits your new identity. And one of the ways that you can do that, if you'll allow me to say this, is to really create a vision for the life that you want.
Hmm.
And we see images every day in our life. We see it everywhere on our phones. We hear it. The music that we listen to, all of it. We want to give our minds new direction. And your divine soul purpose has been there all along. You felt these pulls. Now I want
Yeah.
you to go back and reflect in your life and remember, what was the pull? You've known all along what your divine soul's purpose is. It's always been inside of you. For me, it was always about writing, but I was too scared. I was afraid of failure. And for 13 years, I
Mhm.
ignored his prompting to write the book. And when 2020 came, it was like, no, it's time for you to write this thing. You need to write this thing because I know what's coming and the choices that other people are making. And I need you're equipped now. You've been equipped by me through all the experience you've been through. You need to help others get a shortcut to joy, because there's going to be too many people out there thinking their life isn't worthless, and my master plan is going to fall apart. I need
Yeah.
I need your help. And so that's when writing this book and sharing all these things that I learned through my own journey to help others it was such a big pull for me to do. And once I did it, oh my gosh, it was like I finally saw myself the way he saw me. And there
Mm.
was no turning back, because that was the last lesson I learned in chapter 15, was the lesson of self-love.
Mm.
Self-love was a foreign concept to me. I don't know about
Yeah.
you, but I didn't
Yes.
understand it until I wrote my book and I saw God's hand in my life in everything he did for me, not to me, for me. And once I saw that, once I saw myself the way he saw me, this perfect being created in his image, there was no turning back. There was no way I could go back to that old identity of not being enough, of being a perfectionist, needing to achieve, to feel worthy. That person was gone. And
Mm.
what replaced her was someone that now looks at significance and kind of like, I, I give myself significance. I don't need my achievements to give me significance. I have significance.
Right.
I'm his child. I am his
Right.
child with gifts that I'm now giving to serve others, to love him
Yeah.
and serve others.
Yeah. Wow. Listen, Sylvia, that I, you're just so dead on point to what I feel like people are going to want to need to hear today. And I want to kind of segue away a little bit here to this part now. Um, your book. Tell us a little bit about your book, and are you a life coach as well?
Yes, I'm a life coach. I call myself a turning points coach because I share a blueprint in the book that takes you from a turning point all the way to your soul identity, so you can identify with that person that God created you to be. And I do it. The book takes you down the path of from my childhood all the way through the pandemic, and somewhere in between. I There were chapters I didn't want to write. And he
Yes.
kept prompting me, and he's like, you're not skipping over these chapters. And now I understand why, because those are the chapters I needed to write to bring me to this space where significance is found within me, because that was such a big piece of my old identity through my achievements, that I take you on this journey of how these beliefs get formed, and how you can actually start switching that around, switching that dialogue around, and not allowing change to keep you stuck, but rather to use it to transition and transform from these traumas into this space of, this is an opportunity for you to shift your lens of your life, to go from surviving, simply surviving, which is where fear thrives, to being a thriver in life. And the blueprint is basically turning points. What is your subconscious mind doing? What is your conscious mind doing? Who's surrounding you? And where's God in all of this? Because it's a very faith based book. It's very spiritual in the sense that the three main lessons that I share in the book are: when change happens, turn to God, for He will guide you to your light, and listen to His promptings because they're always there. He will place a desire in your heart as you're going through change to guide you to exactly where you want to go, where you've been desiring to go, but didn't know where to start. He's going to give you that blueprint, but you've got to have faith. You've got to have faith and trust in Him. And I kind of guide you on how to trust those instincts that He will, those God instincts, because they show up a lot, and how to really decipher, like understand, is it just a thought that your fear-based subconscious mind is kind of throwing at you, or is it truly an instinct, a God instinct, where He's guiding you towards your soul? So the book kind of gives you a blueprint on how to use change to thrive at life.
Wow. Great. I am someone who I could tell you before I was 50, I read maybe 5 books in my life. Um, God used my trauma, my event. I ended up writing a book. I'm like, God, I'm not an author. He's like, no, I'm an author. And so we wrote my book, but I have read now in the last 2, I don't know. I don't even know how many books I've read. 50 books in the last year. And
That's
I'm
awesome.
really realizing how important books are, what great resources they are. So I'm going to make sure that we put a link in here for that. But I also want to transition to the what did you call yourself? Not a life coach, but a
Turning points coach.
coach. I want to also gear that because I know there are some people listening, just facts, that are living in fear. And sometimes we can't afford a counselor, we can't get that time right, and things like this. And I would like for my listeners to consider that, because, and especially some of you who are going through some of what we just talked about, you can relate to some of what we talked about, and you're living in that fear, your identity is somewhere else. I want to put your link in that. I want to gear
Sure.
them towards that, and I want you guys to think about that, because that is something that would be probably more doable for you, uh, and you know, something you can do from the privacy of your home, but also where you have someone that you've just listened to, that you can have great faith knowing that God has ordained this moment for you to hear this message today. So, uh, Sylvia, I'm going to put all that in our link here,
Sure.
so that our viewers have that. And before we log off and close, I want to say first, thank you for being on here. This is our 45th episode, which is a great milestone. But I'm so thankful. I've had to regroup for a minute, and I've really prayed over some of the the guests that we've been having on here, and I see where God has just really ordained this moment to bring such a great message. So I want to thank you for being here today and for letting God prompt you with what you've shared with us today. But is there anything you'd like to close with? Anything you'd like to say before we close out?
Yes, you are a light in this world. Whoever's listening, you have such gifts, such beautiful gifts. Please turn to Him if you find yourself at a moment in time where you're confused, you're doubtful, your fears are controlling your choices. He's right there. He just needs you to turn to Him so that He can start guiding you and your desires for the beautiful life that waits for you. There's so much that you can do for this world. You are amazingly talented. You are a bright, shining light. Please know that. And that's all I have to share with you guys today. Thank you so much for tuning in today.
Thank you, Sylvia. I can't add anything to that. So we're going to sign off with that. To my listeners, until next time, I just ask you to keep being intentional. You guys, joy sharing this with you today. Thank you.